Hi everybody, welcome to week 4. Just recording this for the second time. Sorry about that. It's very frustrating that I lost recordings, but we'll catch up in good time. So this one is on genetics, inheritance, and evolution. It'll be partly on the slides, but a lot of me using the whiteboard and talking, as I'm sure you're used to by now. So, genetics is the transmission and variation of inherited characteristics in a particular chromosome, which is made up of DNA. When we look at genetics, we're looking at the following. I'll get rid of that up there. Looking at this code, everything in genetics begins with the code, right? So I'm just going to stop sharing so you can see the whiteboard. We have whiteboard, you can see, so everything is built off this genetic code of GATC. In DNA, we have backbone, and we'll go more into the actual science and molecular biology of DNA as the weeks go on. So GATC, we have this is what the genetic code looks like. Obviously, there's lots of variations, but this is the core code that says to you what you'll look like, what you'll sound like, what you like, how tall you'll be, what color your hair will be, what color your eyes, so on and so forth. So this is genetic code. And this genetic code encodes for proteins. So we have the gene, which is the genotype. We have proteins, which are the phenotype. So the gene, which is the genotype, the proteins, which is what are produced, make the phenotype, or say your hair color. Eye color. The genotype says what genes you will have. The proteins that are produced then say what color. The eyes, your eyes will be, what color your hair will be. So, why did I go forward? Still on, oh, I need to share these slides because you guys will have them. I'll send them out. So, evolution is this complex thing, right? And it's just, things get better in a certain environment over time. And you get the DNA, which is, so, say it's this, in one generation. This is the code for this certain thing. And over time, this changes around to become DNA. Now this is completely random. It may not actually do anything, but what it can do is confers an advantage. So I like to use the people that live in high altitudes as an example. Over the last 5,000 years, they have evolved to live at really high altitudes. So the oxygen content is low. Now, if I went and tried to live on at 5,000 meters, 3,000 meters, whatever the number is, I wouldn't survive very long. But these people can not only survive, but they thrive. They carry everyone's packs. Now, yes, you can train to be better at high altitudes and low oxygen, but you'll never be as good as these guys. And that's because over time, the hemoglobin molecule that carries oxygen around the blood carries 25% more oxygen. Now this is important because breathing in the same air, these guys have 25% more oxygen traveling through their blood. And this happened at the genetic level, way back here, at this GATC code. So the gene that encodes for hemoglobin was altered. And that was probably happened completely at random. But this guy, he might have been one of this population of 4 people. And these are, say, 2 males, 2 females. Sorry, 2 females, 2 males. This guy is working harder and faster. He's stronger. He's better at physical activities. So the females go, I don't want to. No one wants to reproduce with this guy. Everyone wants the strong alpha male. So eventually, this population, in a few more, say 3 generations, would have just this gene being passed down. So that's how inheritance occurs. If you get, not inheritance, evolution, you get a random mutation in a gene, and that then confers an advantage or conveys an advantage. Everybody wants to have offspring with that person because they're the best, and eventually the old gene dies out completely. So, development of genetics. How did we stumble across inheritance in genetics? There's a guy called Mendel. He's a monk. He was a monk in the 1700s. He was breeding peas, trying to make better pea varieties. And what he was doing, he was crossing them. So, I don't know, fuzzy verge variety with a smooth, and then seeing what happened in the next generation. And when he was doing this, he stumbled across some patterns of inheritance. So when you mix a fuzzy pea with a smooth pea, you could track the inheritance and the ratio of the offspring based off Mendel's work. Now, you've probably come across Punnett squares. And this is how we turn. So you can see here that he looked at all of these different, what's the word? So seed shape. So you can't see the point of the screen. Seed color, flower color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and the stem height based on the characteristics of the two plants that were bred. So we have Reginald Crundle Punnett, William Bateson. They came up with this idea. So Mendel's work was great, but it was quite basic. It was in the 1700s, so we didn't really know a lot. But we have what's called Punnett square. We have these traits. We base them off dominant and recessive. So if you have brown eyes, you have 2 copies of the dominant gene. So that's your genetic little link there. So if you, for blue eyes, you have 2 recessive copies of the gene for eye color. It just means that the genes are different. If you have a parent who is so we have someone with brown eyes, someone with blue eyes will create more than likely, so B, so this is the brown eyes, blue eyes. So someone with brown eyes, someone with blue eyes, stop sharing so you can see, has a baby. They're like, the only real possibility is that baby has brown eyes. If they have a big B, little b, they have brown eyes, blue eyes. So they're always going to have brown eyes. So we're just going to look at the phenotype ratio. So let's look at a genetic disorder. And this is where it gets really complicated. So everybody has 2 copies of every gene. Some people have 2 dominant copies. So they are usually perfectly healthy. Some people have 1 dominant and 1 recessive. The recessive gene is the faulty gene. The one that doesn't work properly. So when they have 1 copy of each, normally they're healthy, but sometimes they're halfway between someone who carries 2 copies of the recessive gene. The gene in this person's body doesn't work at all. The recessive version doesn't work. This person may have some symptoms of the disease. This person is fine. This person sometimes is also fine. If we put this into a square, so 2 people that both carry the dominant gene, they can't pass that gene on. Generally speaking, this is very simplified, but they can't pass that gene on. Whereas if one of the parents carried 1 recessive gene, this person is perfectly healthy. This person is what we call a carrier. They are carrying the recessive gene. This person has no trace of it. So, same. This person has a 25% chance of being a carrier. So when the genes come together, we have the sperm and the egg, the genes come together, you get this recombination, then you will have 75% chance of being fine, 25% chance of being slightly affected or being a carrier. If it was 2 carriers of the gene, they suddenly go a 50% chance of being a carrier and a 25% chance of being fine and being completely affected. There's a disease called sickle cell anemia that they think developed when the human body was trying to protect itself against malaria. So normally your blood cells look like this. Nice donut shape with hemoglobin in the middle. So this would be BB. So if you had 2 copies of the normal gene for the hemoglobin, or the dominant gene, your blood cells look like that. Fortunately, people that have 1 copy of the dominant and 1 copy of the recessive, they're somewhere between normal and diseased. So this came about because the body wanted to alter the shape of the blood cells. And in doing so, it stops malaria infection in its tracks. But it also kills the person much quicker. So it didn't really work. But a person with 2 copies of the recessive gene, their blood cells look like this, and they clump together in the blood. Up until not long ago, the likelihood of that person surviving into their teens was really low, but now it's much higher. So some diseases, you can have 1 of each and you'll still be affected by it. So it's a process of evolution. Just gonna so this is changes over time. So this evolution has happened over 4 billion years. Most of it happens randomly, but some doesn't. So the mutations, these occur in the DNA, in that genetic code. And we can hijack this when we're trying to grow or create new plant varieties. So we can create these mutations in the DNA through exposing plant seeds to radiation, and then we breed them. And then we hopefully get a random mutation in the right place, which makes that plant better at growing. That's how the vast majority of our food crops were created. The recombination. So this is the process of when the sperm and the egg cell come together, all of the chromosomes break up and then they recombine together randomly. So you can get new genes and genes in places that weren't before, genes that run faster than others, genes that run slower. And this causes changes to the genes and to where the genes sit. We have natural selection. Natural selection is survival of the fittest. So, fish stayed in the water. Humans, or whatever the next species up from humans is, that I can't remember now, developed lungs. So they could then become land dwelling. So the fish that developed lungs, land dwelling, then became other species. Natural selection can also be, there is species of bacteria called tac, and they can survive at 97 degrees Celsius. So over time, they lived in hot pools, and their genes allowed them to only select for the next species that could survive in increasingly hotter water. And isolation is, you can see it playing out in Australia. So Australia has some of the most poisonous animals in the world. And that occurs when you have no outside input and the species within an isolated system are only competing against each other. So the toxicity of the venom in the snakes has to be more toxic than the next ones, the previous one, to survive. So it's constantly. Whereas if other snakes were coming in from the outside and they had a lower level of venom, then we wouldn't have this selective pressure to become more and more venomous in isolation. So, mutations. Mutations happen completely natural. Without mutations, we wouldn't evolve and we wouldn't change. These happen, I think, up to 2% of the genes that are passed to the next generation are wrong. So it's really 2% of 2.2 billion base pairs is a lot of DNA to be wrong. So it introduces the genetic variability, or the raw materials for this evolution. Now, mutations can also be bad. We know sunlight, alcohol, environment, workplace chemicals can all induce mutations. If those mutations are in the wrong gene, in the wrong cell, can cause cancer. So mutations are good, but they are also, when they're not controlled, can be very bad. So adaptation, that a certain person based on their genes only may be better suited to an environment than another. So humans, so let's look at the guy that can live at 5,000 meters where I can't. His genome or his genotype is far more suited to that than mine. whereas I might have other genes that might be better suited to other areas. So this means that if we look at so this is called homozygous dominant, this double B. And that means that those who have the two dominant genes are more likely to survive and pass on their genes than these guys. So the dominant genes are the ones we want to pass on, the double B. The adaptability says that the most adaptable population becomes homozygous, or two big B's. So this is where climate change is really going to mess things up. This is adaptability. So they adapt to a certain environment. So that's the key there. The environment has to stay constant. If you change the environment, then that species will no longer survive. If we look at the geological record of Earth, the environment does not remain constant. Hundreds of millions of years ago, all the continents were together in one giant continent. Now we know they're not. So the what was I saying? Completely forgot that. So the environment doesn't stay the same. So adaptation is the ability to become homozygous, which is double big B's. We have adaptability, which is the ability to have two copies. So the big B and the little b. At some point, the organism might need the little b. And this is what we call heterozygous. So although it may mean that this population may be more susceptible to the genetic disease, it allows this population to quickly alter and change because it has two different copies of the gene, not two of the same. And there was a species of cheetahs that went extinct worldwide, and they thought they could breed them back into existence in the zoos. But their breeding population was so small, they were all the same. They all had the same genotype, or the big B or big B, small b. And unfortunately, as soon as they took those cheetahs, the double big B cheetahs, out of the zoo and put them into a different environment, they all died. So you need to have this wide genetic variability in order to have adaptability. Humans have the biggest genetic diversity. I mean, I think 2 people can make 7 trillion different combinations. So no 2 people will ever be the same, and humans have always had incredible adaptability compared to other species. So, like I said earlier, the genetic diversity comes from evolving over 4 billion years. So we started here with bacteria, archaea, probably even smaller than that, all the way to humans. That's 4 billion years. So the genetic diversity on the planet is absolutely incredible. So, what is a mutation? So, we have a so that's what the genetic code would look like. Let's say this is for, I don't know, cold weather tolerance. Eventually, these will change naturally. And so we take away just completely by mistake. And this completely changes the product of this gene or the protein that's produced. So this could make someone either more cold weather tolerant or less. We also have mutagenic substances. And what they do is they look like these. So this is 5-bromouracil, which is bromine, a bromine compound. Looks like something else. So we put a square on it. So that means that this gene no longer functions as well as it should. It creates something new. Sometimes that infers a positive change. If it infers, infers a negative change to the organism, then that organism may not survive. So it's not, the gene doesn't get passed on. But if it gives it a better tolerance for cold weather, then that gene is going to be passed on because more people are going to want to have offspring with the guy that can survive the cold weather or the lady that can survive the cold weather. Now we're not talking these days, obviously we have taken away all those issues with modern lifestyles. So, recombination. It creates new genetic combinations that weren't there in the present. So if mutations stores up all of this variability and variety by changing the genes every now and then recombination puts them together in different weird, wacky ways. So a lot of the time, this would be considered random. This isn't a directed event. It happens at random. So we have, let's say these are 2 chromosomes from the parents. The body will sort of cut them into 3, and you might get that might be the parents, and that is the offspring. That's what their genes look like. So they've been chopped and changed and moved around. And this again can create new phenotypes by creating new genes, new combinations of genes, swapping around the chromosomes where it fits on through this process of recombination. So this crossing over is when it breaks up and rearranges. So the number of chromosomes involved has a big impact on the possible number of different genes that can be produced. And that's why I really think the human genome is so big and that it doesn't really have, a lot of it doesn't have any use. It's what we would call junk DNA. And we've got all this variation over time in our genome, so only about 7% is actually used for genes. And this recombination of chopping and changing it allows us as a population to survive. So we have a huge amount of genes, we have a huge amount of chromosomes, so the genetic variability within the human population is almost infinite. You'll never ever get two people that look exactly the same, unless they're twins. And 99% of our genes are homozygous, so big P, little p. You'll find a dominant and a recessive copy for most people. So this is the cool one, natural selection. Charles Darwin, 1859. And those that are better suited to survive in a certain environment will survive. And those traits from those will be passed on to the next generation. And it's called natural selection because it happens randomly. It's not guided by a hand, it's not guided by anything. So we have the iguana in a terrestrial habitat. So they're carnivores, that's what they look like. Whereas if you took into the water in a marine habitat, it's completely different. So it's had to adapt and change in order to survive as the fittest. And you can see that as a freaky looking thing. That's a marine iguana compared to your inside a terrestrial habitat. So this is the melanism or skin color, or the melanin in the skin. And for some reason, the melanic form, which is the colored form, is superior in viability to the light form. And that doesn't have anything to do with the color of the bird, of the butterfly. It has to do with, okay, that's effectively two subpopulations. So the genes in this one are different to the genes in this one, not just in for the color or the pigmentation of it. So the pigmentation has caused changes, and those changes have been then conferred genetically to create other changes. So one of those two butterflies is more viable than the other. So the one that's more viable will be selected by nature to survive because it will just survive better. And it will continue to evolve and adapt, whereas the melanic form, also the lighter form, will not. Eventually it will die off. So, isolation, again, don't know what it's done to my slide there. So interbreeding and gene exchange. So the whole isolation causes a low genetic diversity. So this would be in populations that are geographically isolated. There's no gene exchange. Every single offspring has the same genes, but they just might be recombined differently. And it may not be physically separated, but they just don't mate with each other to produce offspring. So there's no gene exchange. Now I can't see what I've put down here. So yeah. So they're not always just physically separated. They may be for some other reason they can't create offspring with each other. there may be 3 reasons for that. So the habitat may be isolated, so physically isolated. So there may be, I don't know, okay, let's look at a river, either side of a river. So there might be one group over here of the same species and another group over here. The same species, but they're isolated from each other, so they can't exchange genes. So they just have this breeding pool here. These guys will be genetically different. So these guys, because they have not come in contact, they're the same species, but for some reason they can't cross the river. There's a magic force field there. So we then have seasonal or temporal isolation. So they might be the same species or able to mate with each other, but the mating or flowering times are different. Mating or flowering times are different. So that is seasonal or temporal isolation. So one might require a wet season, one might require a dry season. And we have sexual or ethological isolation. So the attraction between in a species is weak. So, finish up on actually defining what a population is. So, the population is defined as a collection of organisms of particular species sharing particular characteristics of interest, most often that of living in given areas. So, human population. Organisms of a particular species share characteristics of interest and live in a given area. Humans don't live under the water. All humans live above ground. All humans have roughly the same characteristics, and we're all a collection of organisms of particular species. But then we have allopteric species. Population. These are separate from each other. So, before globalization, before the ability to travel, human populations in Africa and Australia were pretty much very similar. But then we had years and years of isolation, breeding, so they became very different. And then we have sympateric, which means 2 separate species become one over time. So 2 species become one. It's basically. So 2 different species or 2 different populations are found in the same areas, and eventually they become the same. So I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you for listening. I'll put up some extra videos catching up on those, and I'll see you next week.